All right, so today we're going to jump into colors and just some ideas on how you can create some interesting um, backgrounds and texture pieces, specifically looking at posters. We do have some practice files if you want to get started. It's actually a pretty simple, just letter-sized document with a freeform gradient I created for you. So we're going to learn how to recolor some artwork. We're going to look at freeform gradients, how we can outline text, and then use that outline text to really do some interesting things with our headlines and start treating text as shape rather than as letter forms and words. We're going to look at clipping masks, which is going to be one of those things that when you have that in your pocket, you're going to be able to do so many things with it. And we're going to start dipping into appearances and effects today. So I will hop into Illustrator. And so just a couple of words on what I have open. I have my swatches and I have my gradient, and then I have our starter file over here. I just brought in my abstract from our last session, and that's what we're going to start with our recoloring. So I'm actually going to come in just with my selection tool and select all these objects. So these are just all black and white, and these are all shapes, and we're going to recolor these.
I'm still looking at the Spark page.
Oh, you are? Well, let's just, that's weird because I switched it to desktop, but it's being, let's try it again. Okay. Okay. All right. So we have my abstract shapes that I created, and you can see they're just black and then a couple of different shades of gray, and I'm just going to select those. So no color applied to those except for the black and white. And I'm going to go up to Edit, and then Edit Colors, Recolor Artwork. And so you can see right away, I can come in here and start recoloring. But these color groups might give you an idea of an even cooler thing I can do. So I can pre-prepare colors and then use those. So I'm actually going to cancel this and come back out and talk about ways I can create those color groups. So I can, of course, create my own color groups by just setting up new folders in my swatches panel, adding colors. And this is a really good way if you have specific brand identity colors that you use, you can set up these color groups and then recolor based on those specific brand identities. We're going to use our color library in very much the same way. So I'm going to open up my swatch library, and I'm in the mood for some art history. So let's go into, let's do Impressionism. And so I can grab one of these color groups. And so I'm going to use this one. And as soon as I click on it, it just adds to my swatches panel. And that's how I get color groups. I don't need these anymore once I've used them. Let's throw my Russian poster art in there too, and just close those down. So let's go back to that recolor artwork. And one of the reasons why I like recolor artwork is I think there's something very simple with starting your designs in black and white and gray that kind of just tears it down to the basic shapes and allows you to focus on those and then come back and do recoloring. And even if I don't use recolor artwork, that's typically my workflow. Usually coloring, any type of color aspect is the last thing I do in a design. I might start my design with an idea that these are the colors I'm going to be using, but I rarely ever design and color right away. You know, a great trick to improve your artwork is if your artwork looks great in black and white, it's going to look great in color. And it just ensures that you have all different shades of gray and tones in there if you do that. So anyway, here's my recoloring. These are the current colors in this selection area. And I can just apply my color groups to it. So you can see that switched my color groups right over here. I'm going to take off that color. So you can see how you can add different color groups. You can start switching those around, editing the color groups that you brought in. So this is kind of a fun way to start selecting your different color groups and doing some interesting things with them. So that is the example of recoloring. You can see I've got really nice contrast in here still, keeping that black in there. And just a quick recoloring. Of course, I could also go through and select it and just click different colors to apply them. But this is a quick way to kind of get everything selected and changed. So for today's work, we're going to continue our discussion of color, and we're going to look at how you can do some different gradients. So in our very first lesson, we played with a very basic linear gradient. And linear and radial gradients are very similar. It's a pretty straightforward answer, but freeform gradients, which is what we have here, are really interesting. These allow you to add multiple points of color along a spectrum. And so if I edit this gradient, you can see what I really have is these 3 points that I've added in, and then it blends between those points. Now, I very specifically put this into a linear aspect because this looks completely different when I start getting into different shapes. So let's do that. I'm going to grab my shape tools and jump into an ellipse tool. And so one of the things that I think is really cool in poster design is to kind of think about large geometric shapes and how those look. So we're going to do that for our first example, and then I'm going to show you some other things you can do when you're kind of thinking of posters and shapes. So I'm just going to draw a couple of big circles. And one of the things you can do when you're kind of doing this design work is to think in terms of like, how can I overlap? How can I create different shape areas? How can I start making these interesting? So now we're going to add this freeform gradient to these two shapes. So I'm just going to grab my eyedropper, and I'm going to eyedropper into both of those shapes. If I want, I can turn this gradient into a swatch. Come on, baby. It's not dragging. That's cool. And so here you can see the kind of the freeformness much easier. So to me, then you start getting into these shapes now start to look a little three-dimensional. When I've layered them on top of each other, it appears that this one is a lot closer just because of the orientation of it and how these colors relate to each other. So I'll draw a couple of more shapes. And so always when I'm trying to design, I like to try to think of like where would these things live? Where might my text live? And how can I kind of create some interesting shape areas that also don't get into the way of my text and content. And so I've got some interesting gradients applied, and you can see because of the orientation, like these three up top look very different, but then this one looks too similar to this. So this is where I can start editing this gradient and doing some interesting things. So I'm going to grab my gradient tool, and now you can see those same stops that we saw up here, but in that circular form. So I can move those around. And I can use these dials to change the intensity of the colors. So as I come in here, just going to double click on that, zoom in a little bit so I can see this a little bit more. There we go. So you can see I can expand that just by grabbing this little handle. And so that's making one area larger. I can change how these are oriented and therefore change the shape of these gradients. Like that. And we'll do something similar with this one down here. And so just moving these around so I get some really interesting different interaction with them. So even though I've really used the same gradient, I've changed how those look. So the next kind of thing that I start thinking when I'm using these geometric shapes is, do I want these to be solid forms like this? I think that can be interesting, but there's other tricks that you can do to kind of change the overall appearance. So I'm going to select all of these together, and I'm going to go up to Effect and Blur. And before I click on Gaussian blur, I just want to reiterate the difference between Illustrator effects and Photoshop effects. So once I put my Photoshop effects on here, I'm kind of constrained by the size I am. They won't scale as easy. So I do like to check that my document raster effects settings are high at 300 before I apply that any of the Photoshop filters. So that means that this poster, which right now I think is a letter size, I could print this out on any printer. It would look good in that letter size. But say I wanted to take that to a larger format, it might not work as well. And probably what I would do if I needed to resize is take off the blur, resize it, add the blur back in. So we're just going to add a little blur to these shapes. And let's just cancel because we're not showing as well when we have them all selected. So let's do this one so you can really see. And you can see as I blur that out, those edges become less harsh. So what I can do is I start thinking about like what's going on in the world with this poster is, do I want all of them blurred? Do I want some of them blurred? Is some of them going to be like a key part of a message or something? And how much do I want these to be background rather than foreground objects? So I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to move this one in just a little bit so it's inside the frame. I'm going to move this around just a touch, get some of this lighter area in there. And there we go. Now I'm going to blur these two. And the cool thing about these effects are, since I just applied Gaussian blur, I don't have to remember what I just applied. I could just do Effect, Gaussian blur, and it's going to apply the exact same blur that I applied up here. So now what do I have going for me? Well, I have some shapes that because of size and blur are retreating into the background, and I have some shapes because of the gradient, because they aren't blurred, that are kind of popping to the forefront. And that's going to work great for what I have in mind here. So we'll come back to these again in a second. I'm going to add some things in about text. So I'm going to grab my type tool. And so the idea of this poster is how you can start creating social messaging. And so whatever action piece or social message you want to create, how can we do that with our forms and our letters and all of that? So I'm going to come in here. And one of the things I like in my character formatting in my properties panel is filtering. So if I have in mind what type of text I want to create, and I'm kind of thinking a handwritten would go well with this image. So I'm liking handwritten. I don't really have any requirements as far as if it's skinny or not, or what I'm kind of liking this one though. Let's see what that looks like. And increase the size. Yeah, that's a good font for what I have in mind. So we'll make this really big. So we've got my text in there, and I'm going to change this color. So one thing you always want to do before you before you start creating outlines is make sure you've spelled all your words right. There's nothing worse than getting to this stage of the game and then realizing, oh crap, I've spelled things wrong. I'm kind of liking that color. I think that'll work. All right. So now I've got just some basic text, but I can't do a lot with it right now. Right now, it's just in this kind of text box. I'm kind of locked into this. But if I go up to type and create outlines, this becomes shape. And so now all of these letters are shapes, and I can ungroup them. So I'm going over to my properties panel. I could also go over to object and ungroup. And now each of these letter forms is separate. So if I wanted to extend the size of this letter and kind of make that an interesting shape, I could do that. You can change the relationships of letter forms to each other. So if I want to overlap in some places, I can start overlapping in some places. And then your text becomes more than just letters. It becomes part of your design shape. Oftentimes you'll find this is where you can collapse in additional messages, collapse in initials, collapse in names, things like that into part of your poster design. You can also work with shapes and colors this way. So I'm going to zoom in here. This little area we got right here. I've got some overlap going on here between the F and the R. And so if I select both of those, I can use that tool we used the very first week, that shape builder. And then let's say I just want to subtract out that middle area. Then you get something interesting going on in the relationship between your letters. You can also decide, like, I just want part of this to come together. So maybe I just want parts of these E's right here to extend. So I can pull those parts out and change what those look like. When you create outlines, you can also bring in photographs into it. So this is a shape, and I could go to File and Place. I'm going to grab a photo from my assets here. Let's do, there we go. Oh. Well, we can mask that in later. We'll mask that photo in. I don't think I had it selected correctly. We'll come back to that. So now that you have outlines, let's just do that. I don't know why you're not placing in there. It's going to bother me if I don't get it placed right away. Still not. Okay, well, we'll mask you. You're cool. All right. So we'll bring it to the front. Oh, you know what? Did I have my direct selection tool? That's probably it. Nope, still not. That's weird. I don't know what I'm doing wrong with that, but we will come back to that when we do our masking. Okay. So you've got a chance to manipulate your text. You've done some interesting things. You've kind of reinterpreted what your text looks like. So let's continue along with our poster and all the things we want to do with it. Well, one of the reasons why I left these objects plain is this provides me with a great opportunity to add in additional information. So we're going to just say we have a meeting. We're going to use that same font. We're going to change the size. So now I can bring in this and on top of that text. And kind of just get that formatted how I want. Now, when I'm getting smaller, this cool font that we picked out is a little bit harder to read. So always keep in mind legibility. So if we switch this to, like, let's say, oh, we're going to get rid of our handwriting. There we go. And let's do kind of like in the Abnir. So we can combine that text. And again, if we create our outlines here, then I can start rotating this shape, making it something interesting within that. Now, if I realize, oh, I should have capitalized Wednesdays, it's too late at this point. So that's why you always want to double check your text before you get started. So now I'm looking at this and I kind of like what we're doing. I've got some things that are really popping here, but I don't like how this edge is kind of getting fuzzy. So what I want to do is like trim these. So there's a really hard edge on these shapes. So again, just like before, I can use one shape to kind of make that happen. So I'm going to just draw a rectangle over this shape. And then I'm going to select that rectangle and my shape. So I'm shift clicking and I'm just grabbing any of the things that are hanging out outside. All I need to do then is control click or right click, and I can make a clipping mask. And so when I've made a clipping mask, now you can see things are trimming really nicely. I've got a nice edge on that. I'm liking how that's looking. Now, something weird has happened here with my text and my shape. That's because it brought all of this mask to the top. So I just need to arrange that and send that to the back. And now you can see that's popping back out. Once things are in that clipping mask, those are like locked together. So I can no longer go in there and edit any of those blurs or shapes, but I can always release the mask over here in my properties panel and change that. So let's go in, we're going to play again with our text. So our text is kind of interesting, but maybe I want to add some other type of effects to it. So another cool effect that I like to use, if you go up to your effects, is this texture and grain. And so this just adds a little bit of it, and I only chose the T so we could do a little comparison, but there's different types of grains that you can use. And let's just go and see what this looks like. So it's very subtle, but you can see it provides that nice texture. And so one thing to kind of warm up your artwork, especially in Illustrator, which can be a little flat, be a little cold, is to use some of those textures to kind of combine things. Another technique, and I'm going to go ahead and draw another shape because I want to do some interesting things with interaction of color. So I'm going to draw another shape, and we are going to make this, oh, I like that green, I don't have anything like that. I'm going to send it to the back. And so now I have some interesting things I can do with some of my text in that background color. And you can see by adding that really contrast green, my text is really popping. Those circles have a completely different interaction. And choosing different hues gives you a whole different vibe. Something very like 70s acid flashback about that color. All right, so we'll go back to our green. I kind of like that. So I'm going to bring up my appearance panel. So window and appearance. And these are additional ways you can start getting your text. And since this is shape, I'm showing you on really shape, even though it's text, is starting to play with your opacities and looks here. So when I click on opacity, and I want to click it on the fill, I can change the color mode. So as I change that color mode, it's the interaction of that background green and this color is what that's creating. So if I move this H, notice how when I overlap different colors, it starts looking different. So that's another way you can add to your text and start doing some interesting things with that. Okay. Go. All right, last thing I wanted to show you with text and shape is cutting things out. And I think we showed the knife tool the other day, but you can also use that on your text shape. So if I just wanted to come in here and do some interesting trims with my text, then I can start turning different parts of my text different colors. Hopefully getting the point that like text is really just another shape object that you can start playing with to create some interesting looks. So I'm going to show you one more thing. I'm just going to do a little letter size over here. Some of my favorite backgrounds, besides using the abstract patterns, are just playing with the ideas of what are these geometric shapes and what do they look like when I start trimming them together and overlapping, and how am I using that to create some really informal uses of space. So even with that type of very simple object, and I would probably trim that out on the edges as well, I have really 1, 2, 3, 4 areas that I've divided that I can present different information in. And then I would want to bring in contrast, because you always want to think about contrast of shape and contrast of color as you start to design. So let's use some of our color works here. So there we go. So now we have some real nice contrast of color, contrast of shapes, and this becomes a really interesting start of how I can put together a really cool poster.